The alarm tore through the chamber before I even understood what it meant. Every light on the central display turned red at once. Delegates around me jumped from their seats, voices overlapping, none of them making sense. I was still holding a cup of warm drink when the floor beneath my seat began to vibrate with the force of the alert system. My hands shook, and the cup slipped, spilling across the polished table without me even noticing. A massive ship had entered the Sol system. Not a trade vessel, not a scout, something large, fast, and completely unknown. I am a junior delegate from Ardennis, a small world that joined the Galactic Council 2 generations ago. My name is Nessa Corin, and on that day, I was the lowest-ranking person in a room full of panicking elders, which meant I was the one sent to actually watch the screens, while everyone else argued about what to do. The council chamber sits at the center of a station that orbits a neutral star, far from any single species' homeworld. It was built that way on purpose, so no one government could claim it as their own. Hundreds of delegates from dozens of species fill its tiers, each representing their world's interests, their fears, their hopes. On a normal day, the loudest argument might be about trade tariffs or mining rights on some unclaimed asteroid belt. This was not a normal day. "Confirm the identification," shouted Senior Delegate Threll, slamming a closed fist onto his console. He was an Olkari, a species known for their calm, methodical nature, and even he looked like he was about to come apart at the seams. The technician at the central station, a young man from Earth named Henry Cole, was one of only a handful of humans working at the council headquarters. He had been hired only a year earlier, mostly as a goodwill gesture after Earth's recent admission into the council. He stared at his screen, his face pale. "It's not in our database," Henry said. "No transponder code matches anything on record. The vessel's mass alone is larger than 3 of our heaviest warships combined. 3 of our heaviest warships combined." The room went quiet for exactly 1 second before the shouting started again, louder this time. I leaned forward, watching the main display update in real time. The unknown ship was moving with a precision that made my stomach turn. It wasn't drifting, wasn't testing defenses, wasn't behaving like any first contact scenario I had studied in my diplomatic training. It moved like it knew exactly where it was going, and where it was going was Earth. "This has to be a Velkari trick," said another delegate, a heavy-set Drenoth official named Boris, his 4 eyes blinking rapidly. The Velkari were a hostile faction outside council space, known for testing border worlds with surprise raids. They've found a new disguise, a new ship design, and they're using it to slip past our sensors. "The signature doesn't match Velkari technology," Henry said quietly, still staring at his readings. "It doesn't match anything." I felt a chill run through me. In all my years of training, I had never once been told what to do when something matched nothing at all. The Council's emergency protocol activated within minutes. Battle fleets stationed near neutral checkpoints were ordered to redirect toward Sol system, the small, mostly unremarkable star system that Earth called home. I remember thinking, even then, how strange it was that a planet so recently welcomed into our community was suddenly the center of every screen in the chamber. Earth had only been part of the Council for 6 years. Humans were still considered new, still treated with a mixture of curiosity and quiet suspicion by older species who had been navigating the stars for thousands of years. Some delegates respected humanity's quick technological growth. Others viewed it as reckless, even dangerous, the way a child handling a sharp tool might be dangerous, not from malice, but from simply not understanding the weight of what they held. I had visited Earth twice during my training rotations. I remembered green oceans, crowded cities, and people who spoke fast and laughed loud, who seemed to throw themselves into everything, with an intensity that other species found exhausting and admirable in equal measure. I did not think of Earth as a threat. I thought of it as new, eager, unfinished. But now, watching that unknown ship cut through space toward their homeworld, I wondered if I had been wrong to feel so calm about them. "Get me a live feed from the Earth orbital relay," Threll ordered. "I want eyes on that planet the moment something happens." Henry's fingers moved fast across his console, pulling data from satellites positioned near Earth's moon, monitoring stations that the Council itself had helped install as part of the integration agreement. The screen flickered, then steadied, showing a blue and green sphere surrounded by a thin ring of orbital traffic. Small ships, Communication satellites. Nothing unusual. Just an ordinary day on an ordinary planet, completely unaware of what was approaching. They don't know yet, I whispered. They will in about 4 minutes, Henry replied, his voice tight. Those 4 minutes felt longer than any negotiation I had ever sat through. The chamber buzzed with calculations, predictions, contingency plans. Someone suggested evacuating non-essential council staff from the region. Someone else suggested preparing a formal warning to send to Earth's government, though everyone knew there was no time for diplomacy if this turned into a real engagement. I kept my eyes on the unknown ship's trajectory. It wasn't slowing down, but it also wasn't accelerating in a way that suggested an attack run. It moved with a strange, almost careful steadiness, like a ship approaching a destination it had visited many times before. "Boris," I said suddenly, surprising myself with how loud my voice came out. "Look at the deceleration pattern. That's not how a hostile ship approaches a target. That's how a ship approaches a landing zone." The Dreadnought delegate turned to look at me, his 4 eyes narrowing. "You think this is a friendly visit? With a vessel that size?" "I don't know what I think," I admitted, "but I know what panic looks like, and right now, that ship isn't panicking. We are." No one had an answer for that. The chamber's main display switched feeds, as Earth's own planetary defense network picked up the signal. Red warning icons bloomed across continents, as nations on the ground began scrambling their own response teams, unaware that an entire alien council was already watching, already arguing, already terrified on their behalf. I thought about the people down there, going about ordinary lives, completely unaware that within minutes, their sky would change forever. Somewhere on that planet, someone was making breakfast. Someone was walking to work. Someone was laughing at a joke their friend told them, with no idea that history was about to bend around them. "The ship is decelerating rapidly," Henry announced, his voice cracking slightly. "It's matching orbital velocity with the moon." "Why the moon?" Threll demanded. "I don't know," Henry said, "but it's slowing down exactly the way you would if you were planning to make orbit, not the way you would if you were planning to attack." The room fell into a tense, uneasy silence. For the first time since the alarm sounded, no one was shouting. Every delegate, every species, every set of eyes in that chamber stayed locked on the screen, watching a single massive vessel settle into orbit above a planet that had no idea what was coming. I felt my hands tighten into fists on my lap. Whatever this ship was, whoever was inside it, the next few minutes were going to decide something enormous. I didn't know yet whether we were about to witness an attack, a disaster, or the beginning of something the galaxy had never seen before. All I knew was that the ship hovering above Earth wasn't broadcasting any warning, any threat, any demand. It was simply waiting. And then, without any warning at all, it opened a communication channel. Not to the Council. Not to any of the watching battle fleets racing toward the system at full burn. It opened a channel directly to Earth. The chamber exploded into noise again, every delegate shouting questions at once, demanding translations, demanding explanations, demanding to know what was being said on a frequency none of us had access to. I watched Henry's face change as he listened through an emergency relay line that Earth's government had agreed to share with Council monitors during the integration process. His expression shifted from fear to something I couldn't quite name. Confusion, maybe, or recognition. "What is it?" I asked, leaning closer. "What are they saying?" Henry looked up at me, his eyes wide, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not them," he said. "It's us. The voice on that ship, it's human." The words hung in the air, long after Henry spoke them. "It's us. The voice on that ship is human." For a moment, nobody in the chamber moved. Then everyone moved at once. "That's impossible," Boris snapped, his 4 eyes blinking rapidly in disbelief. "Earth has no ship of that size. Their entire fleet combined doesn't come close to that mass." "I'm telling you what the audio says," Henry replied, his voice steadier now, though his hands still trembled slightly on the console. The voice identifies as Captain Daniel Ward, requesting permission to make planetary approach. He says he's transmitting an identification code that predates the Council's monitoring agreement with Earth. "Predates it by how much?" Threll asked. Henry checked the data scrolling across his screen, and his face went pale all over again. 40 years. The chamber went silent in a way I had never experienced before. 40 years. Earth had only been part of the Council for 6. 40 years ago, humanity hadn't even developed reliable interstellar travel, not by any record the Council had on file. Their first confirmed faster-than-light vessel was logged at 22 years ago, a small exploratory craft that barely made it past their own solar neighborhood before turning back due to fuel limitations. So how could a ship using a 40-year-old identification code be sitting in orbit above their homeworld right now, broadcasting a human voice? I thought back to my training, to the long hours spent memorizing Council protocols on first contact and species verification. None of it had prepared me for a scenario like this. None of it had prepared anyone, judging by the chaos breaking out around me. "Get me a direct line to Earth's primary government council," Threll ordered. "I want answers, and I want them now." It took nearly 10 minutes to establish contact, 10 minutes that felt like an eternity, as the unknown ship continued to sit silently in orbit, having said its piece, and apparently waiting for a response. When the channel finally opened, the image on screen showed a woman standing in what looked like a heavily guarded command center, her expression a mixture of confusion and something I could only describe as carefully restrained hope. She introduced herself as Laura Bennett, Senior Liaison for Earth's Planetary Defense Coordination Office. Her voice was calm, professional, though I could hear the strain underneath it. "We're as confused as you are," she said, addressing the assembled council delegates through the relay. "That ship matches no current registry, but the identification code it transmitted, it belongs to a mission that was declared lost. The Meridian Expedition." "Explain," Threll said, his tone sharp. Laura took a breath before continuing. 41 years ago, before Earth had any contact with the Council, before we even knew alien life existed beyond reasonable doubt, our scientists launched an experimental deep space vessel. It was meant to test long-range survival systems, a generational mission designed to travel beyond our solar system, using technology that, frankly, shouldn't have worked as well as it did. The ship was called the Meridian. It carried a crew of 200 volunteers, scientists, engineers, families willing to take the risk. "And it was lost," I said quietly, almost to myself. Laura nodded, her eyes flicking toward the camera, as if she could see me specifically among the crowd of delegates. "Contact was lost, 8 years into the mission. No distress signal, no wreckage, nothing. We assumed the worst. The mission was declared a failure, a tragedy. We mourned them, we built memorials, and then, over time, as Earth joined the wider galactic community, the Meridian became something of a footnote, a sad story from before we knew our place among the stars. And now it's back," Henry said, finishing her thought. "Now it's back," Laura agreed. 41 years later, with a ship that, based on what little our sensors can analyze, has been substantially modified from its original design. Significantly modified. The chamber buzzed with quiet, urgent conversation as delegates began processing what this meant. A human ship, presumed lost for over 4 decades, suddenly reappearing, with a vessel 3 times the size of anything the Council fleet currently fielded near that border. It defied every protocol, every expectation, every careful assumption the Council had built about Earth's capabilities. "Open a channel directly to the ship," Threll said. "I want to speak with this Captain Ward myself." It took several attempts before the connection went through. When it did, the image that appeared on the main display was nothing like what I expected. I had pictured, perhaps unfairly, some battle-hardened figure, scarred and severe, shaped by decades of survival in deep space. Instead, the man who appeared on screen looked tired, in a way that seemed to go deeper than simple exhaustion, his eyes carrying the particular weight of someone who had seen things he hadn't yet found the words to explain. Daniel Ward looked to be in his 60s, his hair gray at the temples, his uniform simple and unmarked by any insignia the Council recognized. Behind him, I could see the interior of the ship, sleek metal walls lined with displays, showing readouts in a mixture of familiar human script and something else, something that looked deliberately reworked, adapted. "This is Captain Daniel Ward of the Meridian," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the translation systems. "I'm requesting permission to make planetary approach and begin debriefing with Earth's government. I understand this arrival is unexpected." Unexpected is one word for it, Threll said, his tone carefully controlled despite the obvious tension in the room. Captain Ward, your vessel has been declared lost for 41 years. You will understand our hesitation in granting unrestricted access to a planet now under Council protection. Something flickered across Ward's face, too quick for me to fully read, but it looked almost like sorrow. I understand completely, he said. We didn't choose to be gone this long. Believe me, if there had been any way to come home sooner, we would have taken it. Then explain, Threll pressed. Where have you been? What happened to your mission? And most importantly, why does your vessel now register a mass and energy signature far beyond anything your original mission specifications would have required? Ward was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I found myself leaning forward, desperate to hear what he would say. Around me, I could feel the entire chamber doing the same, hundreds of delegates from dozens of species all holding their breath, waiting. We found something out there, Ward finally said. Something we weren't supposed to find. Something none of you, with all your charts and survey records, even know exists. And what we found, it changed everything about how we had to survive. Be specific, Threll demanded. Ward's expression hardened slightly, the tiredness in his eyes giving way to something more guarded. I'll be specific when I'm standing in front of Earth's government, with my full crew present, and not before. I owe them that much, after everything they sacrificed to get us home. What I can tell you now is this: we are not a threat to the Council. We never wanted to be gone this long, and we never wanted to come back armed the way we are. But out there, beyond your charted borders, there are things that don't care about your treaties or your protocols. We learned that the hard way, and we paid a price for that knowledge that I am not willing to discuss over an open channel, with 200 strangers listening in. I felt a chill settle over the chamber as his words sank in. 200 strangers. He meant us. The entire Council, every delegate, every observer, all of us reduced to strangers in his eyes, despite representing the very organization that his own homeworld had so recently joined. Captain Ward, I said suddenly, surprising myself again by speaking up in a room full of senior officials. Every eye turned toward me, but I pressed on anyway. My name is Nessa Corin, delegate from Ardennis. I understand your caution, but you have to understand ours as well. An unknown vessel of your size appearing without warning, no matter how it identifies itself, triggers fear. Real fear, the kind that leads to mistakes on both sides. If you want trust, you'll need to offer something more than caution in return. Ward studied me through the screen for a long moment, and I held his gaze, refusing to look away despite the nervous energy buzzing through my body. Fair, he said finally. Here's something more then. 8 years into our mission, we encountered a colony. Not human, not from any species in your registry. They were dying, the last survivors of a civilization that had been hunted nearly to extinction by something that still exists out there. Something old and patient, and far more dangerous than anything your fleets are prepared to face. We made a choice that day. We chose to help them, rather than turn back and report what we'd found. That choice cost us our ability to return home for a very long time. It also taught us things about survival, about technology, about threats, that I suspect your council has no current framework for understanding. The chamber was utterly silent now, every delegate processing the weight of what Ward had just revealed. I felt my pulse quicken, a mixture of fear and something else, something almost like awe, at the scale of what this single human captain had just casually described. You're saying there's a threat beyond our charted space, Threll said slowly, that the council has never encountered. I'm saying exactly that, Ward confirmed. And I'm saying my crew and I have spent 4 decades learning how to survive it. That knowledge is part of why this ship looks the way it does now. We didn't choose to become what we are. We had no other option. Henry, who had been quietly monitoring sensor data throughout the exchange, suddenly leaned forward, his expression tightening. Captain Ward, our scans are picking up additional vessels emerging from the same trajectory you arrived from. Smaller, but numerous. Can you confirm what these are? For the first time since the conversation began, Ward's composed expression cracked, just slightly. He glanced off screen, exchanging a few quiet words with someone I couldn't see, before turning back to the camera. Those are evacuation transports, he said, carrying the survivors of the colony I mentioned. We brought them with us. They had nowhere else left to go, and we weren't about to leave them behind a second time. The chamber erupted into a fresh wave of noise, delegates shouting over one another, demanding explanations, demanding to know how many additional unknown vessels were now approaching council space, demanding to understand what kind of diplomatic and logistical crisis had just been dropped into our laps without warning. I sat back in my seat, my mind racing to keep up with everything I had just heard. A lost human expedition, returned after 41 years, carrying refugees from a civilization none of us had ever heard of, fleeing a threat that apparently existed somewhere beyond the edges of everything the Council considered known space. This wasn't an invasion. It was something far more complicated, and in its own way, far more unsettling. "Captain Ward," Threll said, finally managing to raise his voice above the chaos enough to be heard. "The Council will need time to process this information, and to determine an appropriate response to the arrival of unregistered refugee vessels in our space. In the meantime, you will hold position and refrain from any further unannounced actions." "Understood," Ward said. "But I'd ask the Council to move quickly. The people on those transports have been running for a long time. They deserve a real answer, not more waiting." The channel closed, and the chamber dissolved into pure chaos. Dozens of conversations breaking out simultaneously. Delegates arguing about jurisdiction, about security protocols, about whether to treat the newly arrived vessels as a humanitarian situation or a potential security threat. Through it all, I kept staring at the empty display where Ward's face had been moments before, replaying his words in my mind. We didn't choose to become what we are. We had no other option. I didn't yet understand what those words truly meant, but something told me that understanding them was going to matter more than anything else happening in that chamber, and that the galaxy I thought I understood was about to look very different by the time this crisis finally settled. Around me, the arguments continued, voices rising and falling like waves crashing against rocks. But I found myself quietly watching Henry instead, the young human technician who had been the first to recognize that voice as one of his own people. His expression had shifted from fear to something heavier, something that looked almost like pride, mixed with sorrow. "Henry," I said quietly, leaning close enough that only he could hear me over the surrounding noise. "What's wrong?" He didn't look away from his screen, where the sensor data continued updating, tracking the slow approach of the unidentified transport vessels. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the Meridian," he said softly. "She lost a cousin on that mission. We all thought they were gone forever. I never imagined I'd be sitting here, watching them come home, while an entire room full of aliens decided whether or not to be afraid of them." I didn't have an answer for that. I simply sat beside him in silence, watching the screens, waiting to see what would happen next, and quietly wondering just how much more the galaxy was about to learn about the species it had so recently, and so cautiously, welcomed into its midst. It took 6 hours for the Council to organize a formal review of the data Captain Ward had agreed to share, and during that entire time, I barely left my seat. Word had spread quickly across the station that something extraordinary was unfolding above Earth, and the observation gallery above the main chamber filled with off-duty staff, journalists from a dozen different species networks, and curious delegates from sessions that had nothing to do with the crisis, but wanted to witness it anyway. I stayed at the technical station beside Henry, partly out of duty, and partly because I genuinely wanted to understand what we were about to see. Threll had granted me limited clearance to assist with translation and analysis, mostly because I had been the one to suggest, hours earlier, that the ship's approach pattern didn't match a hostile profile. Apparently that small observation had earned me a measure of trust I hadn't expected. The refugee transports had been allowed to hold position at a safe distance from Earth, monitored closely by both Council and Earth Defense Forces, while negotiations continued about how to proceed. Captain Ward, true to his word, had agreed to transmit a portion of the Meridian's recorded logs to the Council for review, provided they remained restricted to a small group of senior delegates and analysts rather than broadcast publicly. I was one of those analysts, mostly because Threll wanted someone present who had already demonstrated calm judgment, and apparently I qualified, despite still feeling like I might shake apart from nerves at any moment. The data arrived in waves, video logs, sensor readings, crew journals, all of it compressed and encrypted using a protocol our systems struggled to even open at first. When the first video log finally played on the secure display in front of us, the chamber fell into a hush that felt almost reverent. The footage showed the interior of the Meridian, though it looked nothing like the polished, hopeful image I imagined from a launch 41 years ago. The walls were scarred, patched with materials that didn't match the original construction. Lighting flickered in places, replaced with improvised fixtures that spoke of resourcefulness born from necessity rather than choice. A woman appeared on screen, younger than Captain Ward, her face marked with the particular exhaustion of someone living through extended crisis. A small device on her collar identified her as Grace Sutton, listed in the crew roster as Chief Science Officer. Day 2,941 since departure, she said, her voice steady, despite the visible weariness in her eyes. We've made contact with what remains of the Velnar colony. Their numbers are far smaller than initial scans suggested, less than 3,000 survivors, down from what their own records indicate was once a population in the millions. The image shifted, showing brief glimpses of the colony itself, structures built into the side of a massive rock formation, clearly designed for defense rather than comfort. The beings who lived there were tall, slender, with skin that shifted color depending on the light, their eyes large and dark, carrying an expression that even across species lines, I recognized immediately as deep, lingering trauma. They call the threat the Hollow, Grace continued in the recording. Not a name exactly, more of a description. According to their oral histories, it doesn't conquer in the way we understand conquest. It doesn't claim territory or resources in any conventional sense. It simply erases. Entire systems, gone, without explanation, without warning, leaving nothing behind but silence. The chamber around me had gone completely still. I glanced at Threll, whose expression had shifted from cautious skepticism to something closer to genuine alarm. This is unverified testimony from a single refugee population, Boris said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. We have no independent confirmation that any of this is accurate. Keep watching, Henry murmured, his eyes fixed on the screen. The footage continued, showing the Meridian crew working alongside the Velnar survivors, sharing technology, sharing knowledge, slowly building trust between two species who had never met before that moment. I watched Daniel Ward appear in several of the logs, younger, his hair still dark, his expression carrying a determination that had clearly hardened into something harder and quieter over the decades that followed. In one log, dated roughly a year after first contact with the colony, Ward addressed the camera directly, his voice carrying the weight of a difficult decision. "We've debated this for weeks," he said. "Going home means abandoning these people. Our fuel reserves, even with the modifications we've made, won't support both a return journey and continued support for the colony's evacuation efforts. The council back home doesn't even know we're alive. They think we're dead. But these people are alive right now, and they need help right now. We've decided to stay. We'll find a way home eventually, but not until we've done what we can here." I felt something tighten in my chest as I listened. This wasn't the speech of an invader, or a conqueror, or anyone seeking to expand human influence through force. It was the recorded decision of a small group of people choosing to delay their own survival, their own return to everything familiar, in order to help strangers they owed nothing to. The logs continued, spanning years of footage compressed into a few hours of review. I watched the Meridian crew age in front of me, watched children born aboard the ship grow into young adults who had never set foot on Earth, watched the slow, painful process of building defenses, gathering resources, and eventually, confronting the threat the Velnar had warned them about. The combat footage, when it finally appeared, made the entire chamber go silent, in a way that felt different from the earlier hush. This wasn't awe or surprise. This was something closer to fear. The recording showed a battle unlike anything in Council military history. Vast, dark shapes moving through space with an unsettling, almost organic fluidity, absorbing weapons fire without visible damage, advancing on the remaining Velnar settlements with a patience that felt more disturbing than aggression would have been. The Meridian, now substantially modified from its original design, fought alongside makeshift Velnar defense fleets, using weapons and tactics that looked nothing like anything in our current registries. "What are we looking at?" Threll asked quietly, his earlier composure completely gone. Adapted technology, Henry said, studying the readouts, scrolling alongside the footage. Based on the data signatures, it looks like a combination of original human engineering and Velnar systems, modified extensively over the decades. Weapons platforms that don't match any classification in our current registry. Energy signatures that our own sensors are struggling to even categorize properly. I watched the footage in silence, my earlier curiosity slowly transforming into something heavier. The ship I had defended as non-hostile, the captain I had pushed to speak more openly, had spent 4 decades fighting something that the entire Galactic Council, with all its accumulated knowledge and resources, had never even known existed. The final log in the batch Ward had shared showed the evacuation itself, the last surviving Velnar boarding transport vessels, while the Meridian and its escort ships held a defensive line against the encroaching darkness. Grace Sutton's voice narrated the final moments, her tone carrying a controlled grief that suggested losses too painful to fully detail in a formal log. "We saved who we could," she said. "Not everyone, not nearly everyone. But we saved enough that their people will continue, somewhere, somehow. That has to count for something." The recording ended, and the chamber remained silent for a long moment afterward, every delegate processing what they had just witnessed. "This changes everything," Boris finally said, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier hostility. "If even a fraction of this is accurate, we are looking at a threat that exists entirely outside our current understanding of galactic security." "And a species," another delegate added, "a slender being from a water world I didn't recognize, that has apparently already developed the capability to fight it, while we remained completely unaware." I felt the weight of that realization settle over the room like a physical pressure. For all the Council's careful protocols, its centuries of accumulated diplomatic and military knowledge, its vast network of monitoring stations and defense fleets, an entirely new, civilization-ending threat had existed just beyond our borders, and we had never known. It took a single human expedition, presumed dead for 41 years, to bring that knowledge home. Threll cleared his throat, attempting to regain some measure of control over the room. "We need to verify this information independently before we make any decisions based on it. I want a team assembled to interview the Velnar refugees directly, and I want our own technical analysts examining the data signatures from that combat footage." "And the Meridian crew?" I asked. "What about them?" Threll looked at me, his expression unreadable for a moment. "They will be debriefed thoroughly, and their actions will be evaluated according to Council protocol." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten with unease. "Evaluated how, exactly?" "They engaged in extended, unauthorized contact with an unknown species," Threll said carefully. "They developed and deployed weapons technology that falls well outside current Council regulations. They've returned home after 4 decades, carrying knowledge of a threat that could destabilize the entire galactic community if mishandled. Regardless of their intentions, Delegate Corrin, these are serious matters that the Council cannot simply overlook, because the outcome happened to be, in this instance, heroic." I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it again, realizing that whatever I said next would carry weight I hadn't anticipated having in this room. I thought of Daniel Ward's tired eyes, of Grace Sutton's steady voice describing impossible losses, of children born aboard a ship that had never been meant to become a permanent home, growing up fighting a war that the rest of the galaxy didn't even know existed. They had saved lives. They had absorbed a threat the Council never prepared for, and now, instead of gratitude, they were facing the possibility of suspicion, restriction, perhaps even punishment, simply because their survival had required methods that made the rest of us uncomfortable. "With respect," I said slowly, choosing my words with as much care as I could manage, "I think before we discuss evaluation and protocol violations, we should consider what would have happened if they hadn't made the choices they did, if they had turned back at first contact, abandoned the Velnar, and returned home immediately. We would have a single ship's worth of survivors, and absolutely no warning about a threat that, by every account we've just reviewed, could eventually reach Council space as well." The chamber went quiet again, this time with a different quality of silence, the kind that comes when an uncomfortable truth has been spoken aloud and no one quite knows how to respond. Henry, beside me, gave the smallest nod of agreement, though he remained silent, clearly unwilling to speak too boldly, in a room that still wasn't sure how to feel about his entire species. "The delegate raises a valid point," said a new voice from the upper tier, drawing every eye upward. I recognized the speaker as Council Elder Vasan, one of the oldest and most respected members of the Assembly, a being whose species had been part of the Council since its founding centuries earlier. He rarely spoke during emergency sessions, preferring to observe and weigh in only when he felt it necessary. "We are quick," Vasan continued, his voice carrying easily across the chamber despite its age-worn rasp, "to judge actions taken under circumstances none of us have ever faced. It is easy to critique difficult choices from the comfort and safety of this chamber, surrounded by allies and established protocols. It is far harder to make those same choices when you are alone, decades from home, facing extinction alongside strangers who have nowhere else to turn." A murmur of agreement and some quiet disagreement rippled through the gathered delegates. I felt a small measure of relief that I wasn't alone in my assessment, though I could tell the debate was far from settled. "Regardless of how we ultimately judge their methods," Vasan continued, "the information they've brought us cannot be ignored. If this threat is real, and the evidence we've just witnessed strongly suggests it is, then our priority must shift immediately toward understanding it, preparing for it, and determining how far it might already be from our own borders." Threll nodded slowly, some of the earlier tension in his shoulders easing slightly, though his expression remained grave. "Agreed. I'll authorize a full technical review and a formal interview session with the Meridian crew and the Velnar refugees. But Elder Vasan, Delegate Korin, I want to be clear. The question of how the Council ultimately treats this human expedition, whether as heroes, as security risks, or as something more complicated than either label, remains very much undecided." I sat back in my seat, my mind racing through everything I had just witnessed and heard. The footage of the Hollow, that vast, patient, silent threat erasing entire civilizations without explanation. The image of Daniel Ward, decades older than when he left, having spent the better part of his adult life fighting an enemy the rest of the galaxy didn't even know existed. The quiet dignity in Grace Sutton's voice as she described saving who they could, knowing it wasn't everyone. Whatever happened next, I understood with growing certainty that the galaxy I thought I knew, the careful balance of species and treaties and established protocols that had felt so permanent just that morning, had shifted into something far less certain. And at the center of that shift stood a single human ship, returned from the dark with knowledge no one had asked for, and a price already paid that none of us could fully measure. I glanced toward the display, still showing a frozen image from the final log, Grace Sutton's tired, determined face, staring out at all of us, from 41 years, and an entire war's worth of distance. We saved who we could. That has to count for something. I hoped, more than I had hoped for anything in a long time, that the Council would eventually agree. The formal session reconvened 2 days later, and by then, word of the Meridian's return had spread far beyond the Council chamber. Every major news network across Council space carried some version of the story, though the details varied wildly depending on the source. Some painted Captain Ward and his crew as heroes, who had sacrificed decades of their lives to save a dying species. Others, particularly networks run by species with long-standing suspicion of humanity's rapid technological growth, framed the situation as proof that Earth could not be trusted, that they had built weapons and alliances in secret, hidden from the very organization they claimed to support. I arrived at the chamber early that morning, hoping for a quiet moment to gather my thoughts before the debate began in earnest. Instead, I found Henry already at his station, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he hadn't slept much, if at all, since the last session ended. "You look terrible," I said, settling into the seat beside him. "Thank you," he replied dryly. "You should see the messages flooding Earth's communication networks right now. Half the planet is celebrating. The other half is terrified the Council is going to use this as an excuse to restrict our development even further." "Is that likely?" I asked. Henry's jaw tightened. "Listen to today's session, and you tell me." He wasn't wrong to be worried. As the chamber filled and the session officially began, the mood was markedly different from the cautious curiosity of the previous gathering. Now there was something harder in the air, something closer to fear dressed up as procedural concern. Boris opened the formal debate, his earlier hesitation from the data review apparently replaced with renewed conviction. We have now confirmed, through independent technical analysis, that the weapons systems aboard the Meridian and its escort vessels exceed current Council regulations by a significant margin. We have confirmed that human personnel engaged in extended contact with a previously unknown species without any Council oversight or authorization, and we have confirmed that this contact resulted in the development of military technology capable of engaging threats far beyond anything our current fleets are equipped to handle. All of which, I interjected, unable to stay silent, resulted directly from a humanitarian crisis that none of us were even aware existed until 2 days ago. Boris turned toward me, his 4 eyes narrowing slightly. Delegate Corin, I understand your sympathy for the situation, but sympathy cannot override the very real security concerns this incident raises. If one human expedition, operating entirely outside Council knowledge, can develop weapons technology this advanced in a matter of decades, what does that suggest about Earth's broader capabilities? Capabilities they have not yet chosen to disclose to the rest of us. It suggests, Vasan said calmly from his usual position in the upper tier, that necessity is a powerful teacher. I imagine if any of our own species had faced annihilation alongside a dying civilization, decades from home, with no possibility of resupply or reinforcement, we too would have found ways to adapt that exceeded our previous limitations. That is precisely the concern, said another delegate, a sharp-voiced representative from the Kaldreth Assembly, a species known for their cautious, heavily regulated approach to military technology. We do not know what other limitations humanity might exceed, given sufficient motivation. This entire situation demonstrates that Earth is capable of rapid, unregulated advancement, that the Council has no effective way of monitoring or controlling. The discussion continued in that vein for nearly an hour, delegate after delegate raising concerns that, on their surface, sounded measured and reasonable, but which carried an undercurrent I recognized clearly by the third or fourth speaker. This wasn't really about weapons regulations or oversight protocols. It was about fear. A young species, barely a handful of years into Council membership, had just demonstrated a capacity for growth and adaptation that made older, more established powers deeply uncomfortable. I thought about the Earth I remembered from my training visits, the loud laughter, the restless energy, the way humans seemed to approach every challenge as though it were simply a puzzle waiting to be solved, regardless of how impossible it seemed. I had found that quality endearing during my visits. Listening to the chamber now, I understood that other species found it threatening. I'd like to propose, Boris said, once the general discussion had run its course, that the Council consider implementing immediate restrictions on Earth's continued technological development, pending a full review of the methods and resources used to create the weapons systems demonstrated aboard the Meridian. Additionally, I propose that any further contact with the Velnar refugees, or any future contact with this threat designated as the Hollow, be conducted exclusively under direct Council supervision, with human involvement limited strictly to an advisory role. A wave of murmured agreement spread through portions of the chamber, though I could see plenty of delegates, including several from smaller, newer member species, looking uneasy at the proposal. That's not oversight, I said, my voice rising, before I could fully think through the consequences of speaking so directly. That's punishment dressed up as policy. You want to take the species that just handed us critical intelligence about an existential threat and strip them of the very capabilities that allowed them to survive it in the first place. Delegate Corin, Threll said, his tone carrying a note of warning. I understand your position, but I would caution you against framing legitimate security concerns as punitive measures. With respect, Senior Delegate, I replied, refusing to back down despite the growing discomfort I felt at openly challenging him. I don't think those two things are as separate as you're suggesting. We are afraid. All of us in this chamber, myself included, are afraid of what we just learned, both about the threat called the Hollow and about what humanity managed to build while fighting it. But fear is not the same as wisdom, and decisions made from fear rarely lead anywhere good. The chamber fell into an uneasy silence. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on me, some curious, some clearly disapproving. Even Henry, beside me, looked faintly alarmed at how openly I was pushing back against the room's prevailing mood. It was Vasan who finally broke the silence, his ancient voice carrying a quiet authority that few in the chamber would dare interrupt. "The delegate from Ardennis speaks an uncomfortable truth. I have sat on this council for longer than most of you have been alive, and I have watched this body make decisions driven by fear on more than one occasion. Rarely do those decisions serve us well in hindsight." "With respect, Elder Vasan," Boris said, his tone carefully measured, "this is not simple fear. This is a legitimate response to demonstrated capability that exceeds our current ability to monitor or regulate. Humanity built advanced weapons technology in secret, even if unintentionally, and used it to engage in extended military conflict without council knowledge or approval. They didn't have a choice," Henry said suddenly, his voice quiet but firm enough to cut through the chamber's murmur. Every head turned toward him, and I saw him swallow nervously before continuing. "I've spent the last 2 days reviewing every piece of data the Meridian shared with us. There's a log, recorded about 15 years into their time with the Velnar, where Captain Ward specifically discusses requesting council assistance. They tried. They calculated the transmission delay, the resource cost, the risk of revealing the Velnar's location to whatever else might be listening out there. Every scenario they modeled ended the same way, with the Velnar destroyed before help could possibly arrive, even if the council had responded immediately and without hesitation." The chamber went quiet again, this time with a different texture to the silence, something closer to genuine consideration rather than simple discomfort. "They made the only choice that gave anyone a chance at survival," Henry continued, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. "And then they spent 41 years living with the consequences of that choice, fighting a war none of us even knew existed, raising children aboard a ship that was never meant to become a permanent home, burying crew members in the silence of deep space, with no way to even notify their families back on Earth that they had died defending strangers." I felt something tighten in my throat, watching Henry speak with a passion I hadn't seen from him during the entire crisis. This was his species being discussed, judged, weighed against standards none of us had ever truly considered applying to ourselves under similar circumstances. "I'm not saying there shouldn't be questions," Henry said, more quietly now. "I'm not saying Earth shouldn't be transparent about what they've learned, or that some of the technology they developed shouldn't be reviewed carefully before it's used more broadly. But punishing them for surviving, for choosing to help when they could have simply turned back and let an entire civilization die quietly where none of us would ever have to know about it, that's not justice. That's the Council protecting its own comfort, at the expense of the very values it claims to stand for." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder if anyone would respond at all. Finally, it was Threll who spoke, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of respect and continued uncertainty. "These are valid points, Technician Cole," he said, "and I will admit, this council has not always lived up to its stated ideals when fear enters the equation. However, valid intentions do not erase legitimate security concerns. We cannot simply set aside our responsibility to protect the broader council community, because the alternative path involves uncomfortable acknowledgement of our own past failures. Then find a middle path," Vasan suggested. "Rather than punitive restrictions, propose a collaborative framework. Invite Earth to share what they've learned, openly and formally, in exchange for support and resources to continue addressing this threat together, rather than treating it as a unilateral burden they must continue carrying alone." A ripple of consideration moved through the chamber, delegates exchanging glances, some nodding slowly, others still clearly resistant to the idea. I watched Boris's expression carefully, noting the way his earlier certainty seemed to waver slightly under the weight of Vasan's suggestion. "I would need to consult with my delegation before supporting such a framework," Boris said finally, though his tone had lost much of its earlier hostility. "As would several of us," another delegate added, and a murmur of cautious agreement spread through portions of the chamber. Threll nodded slowly. "Very well. I propose we adjourn this session to allow individual delegations time to consider the framework Elder Vasan has suggested. We will reconvene tomorrow to finalize our official response to Earth and the Meridian expedition." As the chamber began to empty, delegates breaking into smaller groups to discuss the proposal among themselves, I found myself approached by a member of my own delegation, an older Ardennis official named Petra Holvain, who had remained largely silent throughout the entire session. "You took quite a risk today," she said quietly, falling into step beside me as we exited the main chamber. I said what I believed needed saying, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the nervous energy still coursing through me. Believing something needs saying and having the standing to say it safely are not always the same thing, Petra said, her tone carrying a note of caution rather than outright disapproval. You're young, Nessa. You have a promising career ahead of you in this organization. Publicly challenging senior delegates, even when you believe yourself to be correct, carries consequences you may not fully appreciate yet. I felt a flicker of defensiveness rise in my chest, but I forced myself to consider her words carefully before responding. Are you telling me I was wrong? Petra was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful as we walked. I'm telling you that conviction without caution can be dangerous, even when the conviction itself is sound. But, she added, glancing sideways at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, I'm also telling you that I agreed with what you said, even if I wasn't prepared to say it myself in that room. That admission surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened over the past several days. Then why didn't you? Because conviction is easier to voice when you have less to lose, Petra said simply. You'll understand that calculation better as your career progresses, whether you like it or not. I didn't have a response for that, and we walked the rest of the way back to our delegation's quarters in silence, my mind still turning over everything that had happened, everything that still remained uncertain about how this crisis would ultimately be resolved. That evening, alone in my small quarters aboard the station, I found myself replaying the footage from the Meridian's logs over and over in my mind. Daniel Ward's tired eyes, Grace Sutton's steady voice, Henry's passionate defense of a species he so clearly loved, despite the suspicion and fear so many in that chamber still seemed determined to direct toward them. Whatever the council ultimately decided, I understood with growing certainty that this moment marked something larger than a single diplomatic crisis. It was a test, not just of humanity's place within our community, but of whether the council itself was capable of responding to genuine heroism with anything other than fear and suspicion, when that heroism came wrapped in capabilities we didn't fully understand or control. I fell asleep that night still uncertain how that test would ultimately resolve, but hopeful, in a way I hadn't expected to feel after everything I had witnessed, that perhaps the galaxy was finally ready to learn something important about the species it had so recently, and so cautiously, welcomed into its midst. The final session began with an announcement that surprised nearly everyone in the chamber. Captain Ward had requested permission to address the full council in person, rather than through a remote channel. After some debate over security protocols, the request was granted, and a small shuttle was authorized to bring him, along with a handful of his senior crew, aboard the station itself. I watched from my station as the delegation arrived, escorted through the chamber's main entrance by a cautious security detail. Daniel Ward walked at the front, his posture straight despite the visible weariness that seemed permanently etched into his features. Beside him walked Grace Sutton, whose voice I had come to recognize so clearly from the recorded logs, and a younger man I didn't immediately recognize, introduced as Peter Lang, listed in the crew roster as the ship's chief engineer, responsible for much of the technical adaptation the Meridian had undergone over the decades. The chamber fell silent as they took their positions at the central podium, an unusual honor typically reserved for visiting heads of state rather than ship captains, but one that Threll had apparently decided was appropriate given the circumstances. Members of the council, Ward began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's amplification system. Thank you for allowing us this opportunity to address you directly. I understand the past several days have raised difficult questions, both about our actions and about what they might mean for your continued relationship with Earth. I'd like to try to answer some of those questions honestly, without the caution I admittedly showed during our first conversation. He paused, glancing briefly at Grace beside him before continuing. When we left Earth 41 years ago, we believed we were embarking on a relatively contained scientific mission, test the limits of long-range survival technology, gather data, and return home within a decade with valuable information for future expeditions. We had no idea, none of us, that we would encounter a dying civilization desperate for help, or that helping them would mean fighting a war that none of your charts, none of your survey records, had ever prepared anyone to face. We made the choice to stay, Grace added, stepping forward slightly. Not because we wanted glory, or because we sought to develop weapons technology that would somehow threaten the Council's authority. We stayed because turning back meant watching, through our own sensor logs, as an entire species was erased from existence, knowing we had the ability to help, and chose not to use it. That choice cost us everything we expected our lives to look like, Ward continued. We lost crew members, friends, in some cases family members, who had volunteered alongside us. We raised children, who have never set foot on Earth, who know this ship as the only home they've ever had. We aged decades, fighting a threat that, frankly, terrifies us still, even after everything we've learned about it. He paused again, his eyes sweeping across the assembled delegates with an intensity that made the chamber feel smaller somehow, more intimate despite its size. I won't apologize for the choices we made. I believe, even now, that we did what was right, even though it came at enormous personal cost. But I do understand your fear. You're looking at a species barely a handful of years into your community, and you're seeing evidence that we are capable of growth, adaptation, and yes, lethal capability. That exceeds what you expected from us. That's frightening. I won't pretend otherwise. What would you have us do, Captain Ward? Threll asked, his tone carrying genuine curiosity, rather than the earlier hostility that had colored so much of the previous sessions. Ward considered the question carefully before answering. I would have you treat us the way you would want to be treated, if our positions were reversed. Not with blind trust, that would be naive, given everything we've just disclosed. But not with punitive restriction either, born purely from fear of what we might become if left unchecked. We're not asking for unlimited freedom to develop weapons technology in secret. We're asking for partnership. Share what we've learned about the Hollow, openly and fully, in exchange for the resources and support to continue addressing it together, as part of this council, rather than as some isolated, suspicious outsider you feel compelled to monitor and restrict. And the Velnar refugees? Vasan asked from his position in the upper tier. What becomes of them? That's not entirely our decision to make, Ward said, but I would hope the Council finds it within itself to grant them sanctuary, formal recognition, and support as they rebuild whatever remains of their civilization. They've lost everything once already. They shouldn't have to face that same fear again, wondering whether this new community will protect them, or simply view them as a complication to be managed. The chamber remained quiet for a long moment after Ward finished speaking, the weight of his words settling over the assembled delegates. I found myself watching Boris carefully, curious how the Drenoth delegate, who had pushed hardest for restrictive measures throughout the previous sessions, would respond. Captain Ward, Boris said finally, his tone notably softer than it had been throughout the crisis. I won't pretend my concerns have entirely vanished. The capability your species has demonstrated remains significant, and significant capability inevitably warrants careful consideration. But I will admit, listening to you speak, and having reviewed the full record of your expedition's choices over these past several days, I find myself reconsidering some of my earlier positions. That's all any of us can ask, Ward replied. Reconsideration, not blind acceptance. Trust isn't something that gets granted in a single conversation. It gets built, slowly, through consistent action over time. We're prepared to do that work, if the Council is willing to give us the chance. Threll exchanged a glance with Vasan before addressing the chamber more broadly. I propose we move toward a formal vote on the framework Elder Vasan suggested during our previous session. Earth and the Meridian Expedition will share their knowledge of the threat designated as the Hollow, openly with Council security forces. In exchange, the Council will provide resources and support for continued research and defense preparation, treating this as a collaborative effort, rather than a unilateral burden carried solely by Earth. Additionally, the Velnar refugees will be granted provisional sanctuary status, pending a more thorough review process to determine permanent settlement arrangements. The vote, when it finally came, passed with a clear majority, though not without continued dissent from a handful of delegations who remained unconvinced that humanity's capabilities didn't warrant more cautious restriction. I watched the final tally appear on the main display, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty about everything that still remained unresolved. As the formal session drew to a close, and delegates began filing out of the chamber, I found myself approached once again by Captain Ward himself, who had apparently noticed my involvement in the earlier debates through the session recordings he'd been given access to. Delegate Corin, he said, extending a hand in a gesture I recognized as a traditional human greeting, though slightly modified given my own physiology. "I wanted to thank you personally. I understand you spoke in our defense more than once during these proceedings, even when it would have been easier and safer to remain silent." I accepted the gesture awkwardly, still unaccustomed to the particular warmth humans seemed to bring to even simple interactions. "I only said what seemed obviously true to me," I replied. "Your crew made an impossible choice and lived with impossible consequences for 41 years. That deserved recognition, not suspicion." "Not everyone in this chamber would agree with that assessment," Ward said, a faint, tired smile crossing his features. "No," I admitted, "not everyone. But perhaps enough did, in the end, and that has to count for something." He nodded slowly, his expression turning more thoughtful. "I imagine this won't be the last difficult decision your council faces because of us. The threat we encountered out there hasn't gone away simply because we've returned home and shared what we know. If anything, I suspect this is only the beginning of a much longer conversation about what humanity's place in this galaxy is going to look like, especially now that the rest of you know what we're capable of when pushed to our limits." I considered his words carefully, thinking back to everything I had witnessed over the past several days, the fear, the suspicion, the gradual uncomfortable shift towards something resembling understanding and respect. "Perhaps," I said finally, "but I think, given everything you and your crew chose to do out there, the galaxy is fortunate that your limits turned out to be as far-reaching as they did." Ward's expression softened slightly at that, something like genuine gratitude flickering across his tired features. "I hope you're right, Delegate Corrin, for all our sakes." As he turned to rejoin his crew, preparing to return to the Meridian and begin the long process of formally reintegrating into a galactic community that had changed considerably during their absence, I found myself standing alone in the slowly emptying chamber, reflecting on everything that had transpired since that first alarm tore through the silence days earlier. The galaxy I had known before this crisis felt smaller now, somehow, more fragile than I had previously understood it to be. A threat existed out there, patient and silent, and utterly indifferent to the careful protocols and treaties the Council had spent centuries building. And the species best equipped to help address that threat was one that, just days earlier, half the chamber had been prepared to view with suspicion and fear, simply because their capabilities had grown faster and further than anyone expected. I thought about Henry, who had spent the entire crisis quietly defending a homeworld and a family history he clearly loved, despite the suspicion so many had directed at his people. I thought about Grace Sutton's tired, determined voice, describing impossible losses with a steadiness that spoke to decades of hard-won resilience. I thought about Daniel Ward, standing before an entire galactic council, refusing to apologize for choices that had cost him and his crew everything they once expected their lives to look like. Humanity wasn't the nightmare the council had feared in those first chaotic hours, when an unidentified ship appeared without warning above Earth's quiet skies. They were something far more complicated than that, something the galaxy was only beginning to understand. A species capable of extraordinary sacrifice, extraordinary adaptation, and yes, extraordinary capability that would require careful, ongoing consideration as our communities continued to grow together. But as I made my way back toward my own quarters that evening, watching the station's artificial night cycle slowly dim the chamber's lights around me, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected after everything that had happened. Not fear, hope. Hope that perhaps, given enough time and enough willingness on both sides to extend trust rather than suspicion, humanity's place within our galactic community would become something the rest of us could eventually be proud to call partnership, rather than something we continued to view through the lens of careful, watchful caution. The threat called the Hollow still existed out there, somewhere beyond our charted borders, patient and silent and waiting. But for the first time since that alarm first tore through the council chamber, I found myself believing that we might actually be ready to face it, not as separate, suspicious factions, but as a unified community, finally willing to learn from a species who had already paid such a steep price to bring that crucial knowledge home. Whatever came next, I knew the galaxy would never look quite the same again, and somehow, despite everything, I found myself grateful for that change, rather than afraid of it.